can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
I Can't Breathe. The last words of Eric Garner, the Staten Island man who, while detained for selling illegal cigarettes by police, pled for his life as he was placed in an illegal chokehold. He died on the streets of Tompkinsville in 2014. Welcome to Metro Focus. I'm Jenna Flanagan. Eric Garner became one of the growing list of people killed by police, and I Can't Breathe became a national rallying cry for Black Americans seeking justice reform in what was perceived as yet another example of police brutality and racial inequality. I Can't Breathe is now the title of Matt Taibbi's new book, which captures the tensions between the police and the Black community before and after the incident. The book not only investigates the details surrounding the case, which gave birth to the Black Lives Matter movement, it also explores who Eric Garner was as a person and deconstructs the many factors that led to this tragedy. Matt Taibbi is one of the most exciting and opinionated young journalists working today, and I'm pleased to welcome him to the show. Matt, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for saying young.
Well, young by our standards.
Right, yes.
But more importantly, this book, I Can't Breathe, is really an in-depth look at this situation in its entirety. And very often when these incidents were happening in the news, we were getting little clips and bits and pieces. So I'm wondering what took you from hearing this story in the news as it was presented to actually going to Staten Island to research this book?
Well, I never intended to write a book about this subject. What happened was when the grand jury came down with the decision not to indict the police officers involved in the case, if you remember, there was a big furor here in the city, and I live not far from Staten Island. I live in New Jersey. I just drove over there out of curiosity and decided to start talking to people on the street about what they were feeling and what they were thinking. And people started to tell me stories about Eric Garner, the person, and he just interested me. I thought he was complex and funny and had a multifaceted personality and mysterious and contradictory. And I ended up sort of creating a kind of biography project out of it. I was just more interested in him than in the issues. And then from there, it turned into, how did this person who was such an interesting but flawed person, what happened to him, why did he die, how unnecessary it was, all of these things, and that's how I came to be writing it.
Well, it's very interesting that you say that you were more interested in him versus the situation, because it seems almost as if you can't separate the two.
Right.
The person that he was versus the times and the circumstances that he lived under. But I'm more interested in what we always seem to lose in a lot of these stories is who this person was, their humanity. Right. So tell me a little bit about what you learned about Eric Garner, the man.
He was a really interesting guy. I mean, when I went out to the street, everybody had a story about Eric Garner. He had a funny voice, and everybody does an impersonation of him. He was argumentative. He would rattle off sports statistics and dare people to look it up and find if he was wrong. He was always right. He was never wrong about anything. He was a heroic eater. He would buy pizzas and fold them in half and eat them like tacos.
Wow.
And he had this he was a devoted family man who was completely about his kids. He had 6 children, and he had a weird quirk to his personality where his clothes would literally fall off his body because he was phobic about spending money on himself. Every dollar that he made out there in the street, he gave to his kids. And that was just one of the weird details that made up who this guy was. He was on the wrong side of the law for much of his life, on the one hand. On the other hand, he had a good heart. Everybody on the street liked him. He wasn't violent. So he was complicated and interesting, and that's why I found myself attracted to his story.
Well, tell me a little bit about the forces that led to the situation, because first of all, the book almost makes it seem like, as tragic as it was almost inevitable that Eric Garner would have died in this way at the hands of the police.
One of Mr. Garner's characteristics is that he had rotten luck throughout his life. He was almost like the Zelig of the modern era of policing innovations. He was a crack dealer at the time that we were making crack dealers public enemy number one. He was being sentenced to prison here in New York State when New York was at the very center of the mass incarceration boom. And when we switched policing strategies to the broken windows theory, which heavily emphasized going after minor criminals, that's exactly the moment in Garner's life when he switched from drug dealing to dealing cigarettes, and became essentially a minor sort of criminal on the streets. Mm-hmm. And he attracted a disproportionate amount of attention from the police because of that. So throughout his life, he was always sort of walking into the buzzsaw of these new policing strategies. And at the end, he had so many contacts with the police that it became the central fact of his life. I think that what finally happened in the end is that he wasn't even selling cigarettes that day.
Yeah, that was the most fascinating part that I found out.
Yeah, I talked to I would say over 20 people who were there that day. Not one person remembers him selling a cigarette. He was feeling unwell that day. He was in the bathroom. He came out of the bathroom, broke up a fight, and after he broke up the fight, he was a big man. He was winded. He was leaning up against the wall, catching his breath when the police came after him and decided to pick him up. So you can see on the tape, if you watch it, there's sort of this bewilderment in his eyes because he can't process the fact that they want to take him in at the one moment in his life when he's not doing anything. And that's part of the subtext and the dynamic of that whole incident is that he wasn't actually guilty of the crime.
Tell me a little bit about the process that happened afterwards, because I understand that this was a very controversial police precinct that Garner was in, or at least that he was stopped in, and also the fact that the district attorney decided not to press charges.
Yeah, so one of the things that was really surprising to me, and as a reporter, as I discovered, researching this, the whole process of taking these cases to grand juries. Now in New York City, every felony case has to be heard by a grand jury. And normally what they do is they have standing grand juries. They sit there and they hear multiple cases a day. So if you have a stabbing, for instance, right, the cops will bring in maybe the victim, the weapon, one witness, they'll go in, the grand jury will talk it over for a few minutes, 2 hours later there's an indictment. That's the way it usually happens in this city. In this case, what they did is they convened a special grand jury that only heard this case. And instead of doing it in a few hours, where they could have just shown the tape and maybe brought in one witness, they took months to consider the case. They had 50 witnesses come in. And the suspicion is, by everybody who was sort of involved in the activist community surrounding this case, is that essentially the DA put on a defense case instead of trying to seek an indictment. And when I looked at it, I found that there was a pattern of cases involving police deaths or police shootings dating back to the 60s, the famous riots of 1964. There was a kid named James Powell who was killed by police. Exactly the same pattern. A grand jury that took months to consider the evidence, had dozens of witnesses. In the 90s, there was another guy named Ernest Sayon in Staten Island, same thing. A grand jury that took 7 months. Lots of witnesses, no indictment. So it's a pattern, it's a trick that they use, I think, to not indict police officers.
What is it that you really want readers to take away from this? What's the most important lesson to learn from the story of Eric Garner?
I think one of the things that happens with these cases is that people compartmentalize them immediately. I mean, in the Twitter age, we're trained to immediately have emotional responses, immediately have opinions, and then we sort of tuck them away in a corner of our minds and forget about them. And in this case, with these police brutality cases, we remember the names. We sometimes remember the police officers, and in a lot of them, and in the minds of many people who read these stories, it's just a story about bad cops who go unpunished. What I hope people take away from when they read this book is that there's a huge bureaucratic political system that rests behind this problem. And it has to do essentially with, I think, white urban voters who don't want young Black and Hispanic men in their neighborhoods. And that's the subtext to these policing strategies. It's designed to help give police the tools to keep people from going across certain lines. And I think until people can confront that fact, this problem will continue to happen, because there will continue to be more and more incidents between the police and young men of color.
All right, so holding up a mirror to society in itself. Listen, Matt, thank you so much for writing this book, researching it, and putting a more human face on Eric Garner, and of course, joining us on the show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.